A prime minister, you are a person with years of experience as a senior prosecutor. Do you really need a public inquiry to tell you that the system needs to change? And isn't there the possibility that that delay could mean that other dangerous cases are missed in the meantime? I think we need a public inquiry to answer all of the questions that the families, the people of Southport and the country have about this case, and to ensure that no stone is unturned, that every failure is exposed and dealt with. I also think we need an inquiry because we are dealing with a new cohort, a different threat, this individualized extreme violence, and we have to have the laws and framework in place to deal with it. But I accept your challenge. We shouldn't wait until the end of the inquiry before we start the change, and that's why already there's been review of what happened with Prevent and the findings and learnings from that, so that the mistakes that were made then would not be made today. That is really important in reassuring the public why we've appointed a commissioner to look into that whole part of the apparatus, and why we will get on with some of the work we need to get on with changing. For example, the law when it comes to the framework for dealing with extreme violence. So we do need the inquiry so we have the full picture, full accountability, and every single question that the families have is properly answered in the proper way. But we need to get on with the change in the meantime, and to reassure the public that every step is being taken to protect their children. Thank you, Beth. Ribby Sky News. Beth RBY Sky News. Thank you, Prime Minister. At now merges the perpetrator was known to the authorities and had been referred to Prevent, the anti-terrorism program, 3 times. He'd had contact with the police, the courts, the justice, the youth system and mental health services. It's a catastrophic failure of the state to protect those young girls. Do you acknowledge that if that information had come out when the riots were happening, it would have provoked further outrage by the public, so you withheld information? Is that true? And do you acknowledge that whatever happens now, whatever public inquiry you carry out, this will hugely undermine trust from the public in the authorities and your government? Thank you, Beth. Let me be clear. Responsibility for the disorder and the violence lies with those that perpetrated it. We need to be really clear about that. But let me address the facts as you put them to me. There has been a failure here, and I don't intend to let any institution of the state deflect from their failures, and I acknowledge that readily here. Yes, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice in a case such as this, but you know, and I know that it would not have been right to disclose those details. The only losers, if the details have been disclosed, would be the victims and the families, because it ran the risk the trial would collapse. I'm never going to do that, because they deserve that justice, and only by having the rules in place can that justice be delivered, as a measure of it now has. And I wouldn't be forgiven if I had those are not just my choices, though it is a choice I would make. It is also the law of the land. That is why I couldn't disclose the details. It's why others couldn't disclose the details. It's why all of you as journalists couldn't disclose the details, because the same laws applied to you just as they applied to me, and it's really important that we make that clear. But the purpose of the rule is to protect the justice that the families and the victims are entitled to. I think that's the right thing. It is now right, having got to this stage, that the questions are asked and the answers are given, which is why we've taken the course of an inquiry, but also why between now and the conclusion of the inquiry we will happily answer any questions that are put to us. But that is why, notwithstanding that, yes, I was being kept updated, of course I did not disclose anything that would collapse the trial and defeat justice in this case. And I don't think anybody could ever have looked the victims and their families in the eye if they had ever done that. Thank you both. Can I have Paul Br please from ITV? Paul Br from ITV. Thank you, Prime Minister. All of us, as you say, as journalists understand the risk of contempt of court prejudicing a trial, but we live in a different age nowadays. We where misinformation and disinformation spreads at lightning speed online. I was in Southport on the day of the attacks. There was a short window in which information could have been released before charge, before any risk of prejudicing a trial. Why didn't you do that? And do you think it was a mistake not to provide that detail there? Firstly, let me address part of your look there. It is true that we live in a different age in that availability. Information is now available online as well as offline, and I understand the frustration of all, but including some journalists who observe the rules and don't report what they know because they know that the law doesn't permit it, and it runs the risk of collapsing a trial only to see information online that doesn't appear to be following the same rules, and that is not acceptable. That has to be addressed and to be part of what we will be looking at, because that can't be right. But in relation to the central thrust of your question, the importance of the rule about not disclosing this information is to ensure that the trial can take place, and where an individual is guilty, they're held to account, as has now happened in this case, and that is why the law carefully restricts what can be said by anyone, not just me as Prime Minister, but anybody in these circumstances, and it is done to protect the family and their victims. That is the right thing, and that is what the law requires. It's also the choice I would make to ensure that my first thoughts are about justice for the victims and their families. That for me is first and foremost. Yes, we can answer questions, and we are now doing so with this inquiry and everything inquiry. That is quite right, but it is also right that the families who've been through unimaginable grief at least have the comfort now of an outcome in this particular case, and you would be putting very different questions to me if I had disclosed information and we were now faced with a decision that the trial had just collapsed and the families would never get justice. You would rightly be challenging me very, very hard about why I disclosed into information. Thank you very much, Paula. Chris from GB News. Chris, GB News. Prim, what we know now about the car link and how it's kept from the public. Do you now regret blaming the far right for all those protests last summer? Was it a far right issue, or were some people entitled to be concerned and upset, not the riots? Of course, responsibility for the violence lies with them that perpetrated it. I was in Southport the day after these terrible murders. I was acknowledging and thanking the frontline police officers and ambulance who had been at the scene. You can imagine what they had been through. They were back at work the next day. They were saying it was just their job. I could see in their eyes the impact it had had on them, what they had to deal with, what they had to see, how they endured that. As I arrived back in London, those same officers were putting their riot gear on and having bricks thrown at them. Those same officers. I don't think anybody can justify that, nor should they attempt to do so. Thank you, Chris. Harry from The Sun. Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm sorry to label this point, but I think it's important. All summer we were repeatedly told that the stock attack was not terror-related, wasn't being treated as terror-related. That wasn't true, because in October the monster was charged with a terror offense. Now information was put into the public domain. Then that didn't collapse the trial. It didn't jeopardize justice. It was just months later. Now you say you knew about the ricin and the Al-Qaeda bomb manual, and he was known to the authorities. Was that, did you know about that personally at the same time? The public, the press, and you, the police were saying this is not terror related. I think that's the enough of the issue, and that's what's upset people. You say you couldn't speak out publicly, that you couldn't do that, but didn't the public have a right to know? Not at least the neighbors who had ring being produced on their street, surely they had a right to know. Well, I think there are two separate and important issues there. Harry, the first is on the question of terrorism, or what constitutes terrorism, and my concern in this case is that we have clearly got an example of extreme violence, individualized violence, that we have to protect our children from and our citizens from, and it is a new threat. It's not what we would have usually thought of as terrorism when definitions were drawn up, when guidelines were put in place, when the framework was put in place, and we have to recognize that here today, because I think most people would say, looking at the facts of this case, it's clearly extreme violence, it's clearly intended to terrorize, and I completely accept and understand that, and that is my view. Therefore, we have to make sure that the law and the framework for responding is appropriate to the new threat that we face, and there we will make whatever changes are necessary in the law to deal with it. On the second point, yes, of course, I was kept up to date with the facts as they were emerging. That is usual practice, but just like you as a journalist, I had to observe the law of the land. It was not my personal decision to withhold this information any more than it was a journalist's personal decision not to print all right about it. That is the law of the land that is in place for the reasons I've set out to protect the integrity of the system, to ensure that the victims and their families get the justice that they deserve. Thank you, Harry. And Jason from the Mail. Thanks, PM. Jason G from the Daily Mail. It sounds from what you're saying like you personally consider this to have been a terrorist attack in the ordinary sense of the word. Is that right? And also it sounds like you don't think that this is a one-off. Should people be worried, and are we going to need further protections in schools, youth centers, because this guy seems to have had some sort of obsession with school mask? Well, thank you for raising that, because I think this is a really central issue, because, as I say, this is extreme violence, clearly intended to terrorize. And my concern is that because it is different to the sort of behavior we've associated with terrorism, Al-Qaeda, there are plenty of other examples which tended to be more organized in groups with a clear political ideology and motive, because it's not that it is a new and difference. It doesn't fit as well as it should within our framework, within our toolbooks, and that is what we've got to change. That is the urgent question that has to be addressed, and it's one that has to be addressed.